Hi there, everybody. My name is John Mancini. I am the Chief Evangelist for Infotechtion, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on information protection in the cloud. And just as a notification, this meeting is being recorded so that we can share it more widely after the meeting and also allow you to share it amongst yourselves. It's also being transcribed, so just so everyone is aware of that. And we'll get started in just a second here. And this is a really exciting topic, I think, for all of us. You know, information protection in the cloud. I've been doing information management in a variety of hats for a number of years, more years than I care to admit. But I think one of the things that's really interesting right now is there's a convergence that makes this topic more germane and more critical to business success than it ever was before. And so if you think about this, you know, we used to be in a world in which information protection, information security, information utilization, information governance all seemed to be somewhat separate topics that were not really discussed in concert with each other. And so where we are now is this, you know, is a convergence, I think, of all of these. And so it all begins with information protection in the cloud. Some really exciting stories coming out of Microsoft these days in terms of how you bring all of these together in a way that maximizes business value. And so what we're going to do today is divide our agenda in three speakers, three fabulous speakers. And so what I'd like to do first of all is allow each of them to introduce themselves so you get a sense of who they are. And then I'll have another couple of comments and then we'll get right started with Vivek. So Vivek, why don't you kick it off and just quickly introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, John. I'm Vivek. I'm based in London, United Kingdom, and I'm the CTO at Infotechtion. Been working with information governance, information protection technologies, and now very closely with Microsoft and Microsoft engineering team for several years. Look forward to this session.
Kunal?
Hello, everyone. I am Kunal Kankaria, and I'm based out of Chennai, India. And I'm a Microsoft 365 Principal Solutions Architect at Infotechtion. My area of expertise in Microsoft 365 is on all the technologies that are related to Microsoft 365 information protection and governance. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer in this area. Yeah, thank you.
Sanjoyan, what about you?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sanjayan Mustafi. I am a principal product manager with Microsoft, almost 16 years. I specialize in security and compliance for SharePoint and OneDrive. And nice to meet you all and in this exciting session. Welcome.
So thank everyone. And go to the next slide, Vivek. Just by way of introduction, for those of you that aren't familiar with, not familiar with Infotechtion. Infotechtion is a vendor-independent consulting firm specializing in governance and information protection for Microsoft 365. The important thing to keep in mind about this slide, just so you can keep in mind kind of how Infotechtion might fit into some of your strategies and plans, is when Infotechtion does work, it starts with those gray boxes at the top, starts with the business drivers for information protection and information governance. It then goes to map information, a broad information strategy, and then talks a little bit from there about what's the architecture that's needed to support that strategy. And then we work very, very consciously at delivering solutions and accelerators to drive adoption in the marketplace and drive value out of the M365 stack. So with that, let me turn this over to Vivek and we will get started. Oh, before we do that, there is a question tab and you can post questions. We will get to those at the end. I will moderate that when we come back, so don't forget to post questions. And if you have any questions at all about Infotechtion, just send me an email at jmancini77@gmail.com. Thanks so much. And Vivek, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, and welcome again. I have about 10 minutes to set the context with you about information protection and recommended practices for protecting your information as we are modernizing our way of working in cloud environment. And I wanted to start that with a bit of a background, a bit of journey everybody has gone through within this space. So kind of building a picture a little bit, starting with enterprises or enterprise users had very much been used to of working in localized environment. This was pre-pandemic several years ago, where we were all working through company provided devices. We had to come into office, if people remember that, that time, and log into VPN, etc. And from an organization point of view, security and protection was all managed through network security because information was hosted in localized data centers in a very controlled environment. From there, organizations kind of transitioned into more globalized information management, looking at SharePoint, network file shares, and investment into ECM systems or EDRM systems, which kind of became the place where the work would happen and people will continue to do the work. That kind of globalized environment started the transition or early transition to cloud, where organizations would look to kind of move into a Microsoft cloud, a dedicated Microsoft cloud. Many organizations sort of moved into that, transitioning from SharePoint hosted environments into SharePoint online environments. And that saw a transition of moving from custom solutions to sort of more native capabilities. But at the same time, that also led to a number of scenarios where organizations would now have to think about data breaches, security perimeter, and how to manage that security when moving to cloud. And moving to cloud brings a number of opportunities with people being able to access information outside of the office perimeter, work from home, hybrid scenarios, mobile devices, etc. And then that sort of built on to think about information lifecycle management, more focus on information governance, more focus on protecting information. And where we find ourselves is today that most organizations are still going through that transition. Not all organizations have migrated to cloud. They're still on that journey to cloud. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that the organizations who have already achieved that milestone of being in cloud, of having majority of their information in cloud and work is happening in cloud, whether it is a Microsoft cloud or other cloud platform, information protection becomes top of mind. We'll share some more statistics later on in the slides where just securing your cloud platform is no longer considered sufficient. We are sharing information internally. We are accessing information from company devices, mobile devices, personal devices, and we are collaborating more with people within the organization, outside of the organizations, with partners, with customers, with suppliers, etc. And in that environment, we want to shine a light on the relevance and the importance of protecting the information and really leveraging the technology which is now available as the last line of defense, as we call it, so that the information is protected wherever it lives and wherever it goes. So that's kind of is the context, and why is it relevant now? As I said previously, our ways of working are changing, have changed already. We are very much focused about managing information all up, but also a heavy focus on what we call as crown jewels, important information, which we want to protect, especially when that information is moving into modern cloud environment. It's accessible, not just from company devices, but from other devices as well. And in terms of that, some of the challenges which that brings is that we are also creating an overwhelming amount of information. We are not only creating information in the form of emails and files, we are also creating information in the form of chats, messages, and various other file formats or information formats. So identifying what's important, what needs to be protected, and how it should be protected, there are a number of factors involved in it. And that could sometimes be overwhelming for users if organizations expect their users to do the right thing of knowing exactly which information is highly sensitive, which information is trivial, and hence can be deleted, and hence can be shared. The same information which is confidential um, is valid to be shared with someone external to an organization in certain situations versus it needs to be prevented. So how do we apply those controls and all of those scenarios and bake them into something which is easily consumable, can be easily followed and understood by our users, and especially with all different formats of applications and information which is being created today. The risk is, of course, for many organizations, protecting value, protecting IP, protecting those crown jewels is very important. And there are not only legal and regulatory aspects which needs to be factored in, but also for many organizations, it's a competitive advantage. It's a reputational element, which if is available in the public domain, then before its time, it's supposed to be available. We work with a lot of those customers who have very heavy focus on brand management, products, bringing products to the market, um, and protecting that information while promoting an open collaboration within an organization is the big challenge. And the risk, if that's not done well, then it could either impact productivity, collaboration across the organization, drive innovation, um, but also at the same time may risk loss of information, loss of value through either unintended leak of value, but also at the same time sometimes intended leak of value. We've seen a number of scenarios where organizations find a significant risk to their information is through human errors, intended, unintended errors, which lead to information being lost, and that being resulted in losing competitive advantage. So what's the solution? Ideally, what we want to implement is a solution where people know what to do. Organizations know their information. Organizations, according to the classification of their information and the risk profile of their information, are able to protect that information. And by doing so, reducing the burden and dependency on users, because we want the users to be productive and not constantly thinking about what is the information, how confidential it is, how sensitive it is, and oh, by the way, how long we want to keep this information for, and if it is no longer relevant, then delete it. We want to automate and embed policies and rules in such a way that it is informing users, empowering users to make those decisions, and in some cases, of course, make those decisions for users as a default. So in that regard, use the technology to make that decision making more intuitive through automation, and embed protection to information where it is relevant. Again, not to all information. There needs to be a balance there, and Kunal will talk about in his section on what those strategies are. But finding that right balance, that whatever your organization's confidentiality classification is, that's understandable and practical, that it can be implemented using the technology capabilities. And wherever possible, look for automation opportunities. So just a little bit more build on it. Some key statistics for you. Why this is important. There's a significant cost associated with data breach, which is proven now that cannot be addressed by just having good security policies. We are no longer living in that world where we can just manage security and manage protection of information through firewalls. and having network perimeter, to then rely just on that to not lose that information. So I think we are all very clear that we've got to do something in that space, especially if the work is increasingly happening in cloud platforms or Microsoft cloud platforms or other cloud platforms. We also have understood through survey, and these are widely available information, that roughly about 88% of organizations are lacking that confidence to prevent sensitive data loss. Actually, I'll go a step further and say that to actually even know what is a sensitive information, where it lives, and what behaviors exist within the organization related to management of sensitive data, sharing of sensitive data, how much sensitive data is today leaving your organization perimeter and actually going elsewhere. And that's the risk which we want to discuss, and strategies for managing those kind of risks we want to address in this session. But this session isn't just about taking a risk-based view. We also see this as an enabling factor. The more confidence we can provide to our users in using the systems, in using the information, and the confidence with which they can share the information also has a positive impact, positive empowering impact to users, that they're doing the right thing and they can do it with more confidence. So if our policies are established in such a way that when a user tries to share information, then they are informed. And if it is not in line, if that particular activity is not in line with the organizational policy, then the users are informed and in some cases prevented from doing that. So that builds trust, that builds confidence. And that's the approach we want to take, and use that to educate our users, manage those behaviors, and through that, empower users to create more value for the organization. And the starting point for that is to have a clear understanding of what is a confidentiality classification. Now, when I think about UK public sector, it's very clearly defined for all UK public sector departments. There is a UK-wide confidentiality classification, which is very publicly available, very consistent, and used by most public sector departments. But how much of that is actually implemented to the information which matches that classification is the question we are raising in this webinar. But also for enterprise organizations, this is a very important point, is determining your confidentiality classification. How many levels do you have? What are the recommended practices around that? What successful organizations are actually doing in that space? And how are they simplifying that confidentiality classification and the definitions around that, that users don't have to read through 10-page document to understand what constitutes a confidential information. It should be super simple. It should be easy for them to understand, and should be able to, apply that and implement that to the information. Just a few more things before I hand over to Kunal. Some of the prevailing scenarios. So we're seeing across customers, organizations, that the need to implement simplified and consistent confidentiality classification, not just as we've seen many organizations have implemented confidentiality classification either as a paper document, which everybody must read, keep in mind, and then just follow that practice that if an information is confidential, then think about it, refer to a document. Oh, I'm not supposed to share this, and I'm supposed to take the permission of my line manager before I share this information externally. And by the way, if I need to share it, I must encrypt that information, and then I must send that in an email as an attachment. So there's a sort of like number of those questions and things people have to go through in their mind, and it's not practical. That on a daily basis, when I'm working with a partner or somebody who is external to my organization, to be able to actually think about all of those scenarios. So that's number one. So how can we simplify that overall story around what's a confidentiality classification? What are the rules around it? And how can we actually help our users make those choices effectively? The second is data exfiltration is is a big challenge. Not just people sending copies of highly sensitive documents outside the organization, but also within the organization. Many of us are working in an environment where we have guests, external users who are added as guests into our platform. How do we differentiate between them? How do I differentiate that the same team where I have um, an external partner from a local authority added as a guest, and in the same team, I'm collaborating with my colleagues and I have some highly confidential data. Do I create a separate team? Do I create a private channel? And by the way, if some of that needs some input from this guest, from the local authority that I'm working with, how do I work with them? So a number of those scenarios kind of play their role in organizations developing those use case scenarios. And also sort of looking at that in that situation, even that the information remains within your Microsoft 365 tenant, how can you create that separation without having to create, completely separate structures? But of course, establishing better protection controls to records. We're seeing, of course, we talked about records management in several of our webinars and the importance of records management, lifecycle management, and the exponential growth of data, because of which there are legal and regulatory risks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there is an element of having better control on records as well. So great, you have identified your records, you've classified your records. Awesome. But how are you protecting those records? How are you protecting somebody from downloading a copy of that record, of that personal file, of their employee data, or a customer data which is sitting in files and not sending it outside? So those are other use case scenarios where organizations are very quickly looking to establish some rules, policies to apply protection controls automatically where they have already classified information as a record. They already know it's a record. And also, especially from a government, we work a lot in various geographies with government organizations, defense organizations, and we know that there are specific scenarios related to, the government requirement to protect important information, official sensitive data, for example, to protect that from leaking outside a particular department. We know that in European Union, there are specific NATO changes which are coming, which are driving the need for additional confidentiality classifications, more restrictions around how data is shared within the European Union and also with countries to whom with the European Union does the business with. For example, UK post Brexit. How is information shared between two regions and two departments? So effectively, what it comes down to is actually looking at your crown jewels. I'm not going to read through everything in this slide, but before I hand over to Kunal, I just wanted to sort of mention that this is where Infotechtion can help you together with Microsoft, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We offer a starting point. And in most of the cases, this is Microsoft funded engagement. It's known as compliance assessment. And the objective of that compliance assessment is to actually sit down with you over a 3-week period to understand, to whiteboard very quickly what's the important information, bring to you for whichever industry vertical you belong to, what other companies are doing in that space, which use cases they have already determined, which might be relevant to you. And then very quickly, as part of that assessment, enable the technology to help you understand that information for which you have developed the scenarios, where does that information live, and what kind of strategies we can develop to protect that information. So we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the session. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Kunal to sort of build on that, on what he is seeing on the ground, working with some of the enterprise customers and how they are leveraging some of the technology and some of the approaches I talked about to build a strategy and implementation plan.
Okay, thank you, Vivek. And now that Vivek has talked about some of the key scenarios that we often encounter with customers that we already work with, what I'm going to talk about is some key building blocks for organizations that are planning to start their journey, Microsoft 365 information protection journey. How does the tech stack look like, and how does it come together to provide a holistic information protection um, overview in your organization. I'll also talk about some of the limitations that are there currently and some of the considerations that you should take while you are implementing the tech stack as well. Some practical things that I have seen while working with customers on the ground. Right. So let's get started with that. Okay. So the first thing is, while implementing information protection, organizations need to think about their confidentiality classification. Many organizations have confidentiality classification which are either too complex um, or way complex for users to effectively understand and apply those to information they work with. So at the outset, your confidentiality classification needs to be simple enough, and you should start with a review of your existing confidentiality classification, whether you call it confidential or official or secret or any other nomenclature that you use. It should be simple enough for users to apply on information under any scenario and no matter where it lives, right? And why do you do that? Is because the confidentiality classification will result in applying protection or detection of sensitive information leaving an organization. So it is no longer about access or permission management on your containers. Containers are storage areas where your information lives, can be SharePoint, Teams, end user devices. While that should still be your first line of defense and should be managed appropriately, and Microsoft Information Protection does provide you ways by which you can classify these containers and apply protection. However, documents go beyond those containers. Protection also needs to go beyond those containers and should stick with the information wherever it travels, right? So be it within the organization or outside, it could be in the cloud or on premises on end users devices, the protections should stay with the information. So classifying and protecting information will provide an additional layer, and in fact it will act as the last line of defense against data loss or data theft, right? But in order to be effective, first and the most important thing is how easy it is to pick a confidentiality classification for your information. What happens, for example, if your information is confidential, what will be your external sharing rules for such information? You might want to restrict it, but there may be certain scenarios where the information classified as confidential needs to be shared externally, right? Might be for any legitimate reason. So how would you support those scenarios? It's something to think about, right? And who is this for? All users and not just certain type of users. While you might have a classification or two for specific reasons targeted to very specific users, but for the most part you will need to factor in all the users in the enterprise. Okay, so the next thing is, how do you apply? What are your options, right? Well, you would want to apply this as automatically as possible, but organizations that we've worked with do choose to provide users with an option to manually select the confidentiality classification, so that the users make a conscious choice, right? Because they are the best judge of their information. Now, the other option, of course, is to automate application of confidentiality classification by letting the sensitivity engine in Microsoft 365 look at the content of your file and then apply a classification accordingly. Now, this can, of course, then be reclassified by the users if they feel it's not appropriate, and this then makes it easier for the users because now they don't have an additional activity of choosing a classification while still empowering them to make sure that they can reclassify the document whenever necessary, right? So these are some of the choices that you will be presented with when you start the journey, right? The next one is to make the right choices when it comes to configuring your protection settings, right? Overdoing protection might hamper productivity of your end users. Um, so think about the larger enterprise who work with some generic classification of information like confidential and internal. While, as I said, there may be specific set of users who work with maybe highly classified information, and only those users should be able to apply information with that kind of classification, right? So here you can have a general protection applied to anything that just sits below that highly confidential thing, right? Like confidential. But for highly sensitive information, you want to empower your specific users with the ability to apply custom permissions and encryptions, thereby making sure that you strike a balance between security and productivity, right? So not all the encryption settings are applicable to all kinds of users. Depending on who works with what kind of information, you could tweak that, and that is some choice that you will have to again make when you start configuring the confidentiality classifications in Microsoft 365, right? And why would you do that? Because if you do not manage it carefully, it might lead to operational issues like dip in productivity of the users, where they might end up spending their time reclassifying information because maybe the permissions that were applied due to the classification chosen by them were too restrictive in nature, right? And they did not have an appropriate alternate classification to work with, and that could be applicable for their scenario, right? So you'll have to make sure that all the scenarios have been taken into account and then come up with your protection settings that are applied to those confidentiality classifications that you will have. How do you do that? Again, by making sure that your confidentiality classification is targeted and have the right protection settings that could cover all possible scenarios like external sharing, etc. Okay. And the next one is, now that you have your classification covered, you should also account for any possible or potential data loss due to malicious intent of users or accidental sharing, right? So let's take the same scenario that we discussed, where a confidential file needs to be shared with an external user. In this scenario, you would want to allow this, but you should take action so that you can monitor such activities on confidential information, right? For example, let's say a specific user shares confidential documents with external users repeatedly, right? And maybe this happens close to the date when the employee is going to exit the organization. Then it is something that needs to be flagged and looked at, right? So hence classification combined with end user behavior will give you some good insights to flag a risky activity. So these are some of the key building blocks for you to get started with your information protection journey. And often to get started with these three items, organization take about 3 to 6 months, and they start creating policies to monitor the movement of information, etc. However, the telemetry from such policies does not lead to an effective implementation plan. So Vivek has already talked about the 3-week compliance assessment that would help fast track this journey. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so what we'll be looking at here is are the technology building blocks to achieve the things that we talked about. First, it is about knowing your information. Um, Getting to know which regulatory information governance and protection laws an organization is obligated to demonstrate. So you start by assessing your current landscape, reviewing your information that's already existing within the estate. Microsoft 365 has capabilities like data discovery capabilities like Content Explorer, Activity Explorer. Without you having to configure anything in the system, they already start bringing you insights into your data that is existing within the Microsoft 365 estate, and presents you with enough information to start your analysis and figure out where your sensitive information lives, right? And then you have some other mechanisms like sensitive information types that use pattern based classification. There are custom AI based models as well called trainable classifiers that also help you figure out where your data is and then how you should uh, use the rest of the technologies that I'm going to talk about after you have done your data discovery part, right? So the next one is, after you figured that out, you start applying retention policies, sensitivity policies. Retention policies allow you to make sure that information that is of value, your crown jewels like records, how they can be retained and not deleted by accident by users when they're supposed to be retained. You have your sensitivity policies where that can stick with the documents like I talked about. Those sensitivity labels stick with the documents, apply protection. They take care of all the external, internal sharing scenarios as well. Um, these sensitivity labels, as I said, can also be applied on containers, SharePoint, and team sites, for example, where you would probably want your most confidential site that should not be allowed to access from an unmanaged device, especially when BYOD or bring your own device is now a norm, right? It's there everywhere. and people need to be productive, and they are enabled with those scenarios as well. So how you could use block downloads, conditional access for your most confidential information through your unmanaged devices can also be handled through these sensitivity policies. And then technologies like Microsoft Priva help organization proactively identify and protect against privacy risks such as data hoarding, data transfers, data oversharing. It also helps you gain visibility into the storage and movement of personal data. So there are privacy based technology like Microsoft Priva that help you do that. Right. So once you have classification policies in place, you need to start looking at ways by which you can take some preventive action against data loss or data theft. Right. Start by looking at some DLP policies that you can configure, which can also monitor movement of highly classified information even beyond your network perimeter, and provide users with some warnings or tips about how to handle such information. Right. Apart from DLP or data loss prevention that covers the Microsoft estate like SharePoint, Exchange, and Teams, there are specific type of DLP that you can configure to make sure that the entire estate is covered, which are things like endpoint DLP, right? That help you safeguard information on your end user devices. You can also configure data loss prevention with Microsoft Defender for cloud apps that let you monitor information in non-Microsoft apps like Dropbox, Salesforce. So most of the information that can either live on end user devices or can be shared through other cloud applications all can be monitored through data loss prevention in Microsoft 365. Right. And technologies like advanced e-discovery, they all work seamlessly with these workloads, right? And in the event of a litigation or a third party audit, you can make sure that e-discovery, for example, is automatically able to decrypt information that is protected by sensitivity labels, which applies encryption and all of that. So the e-discovery works very seamlessly with the other technologies that I already talked about. And the last step would be to make sure to tap into any risky user behaviors, like data theft by employees who are close to leaving the organization, and what we could also term as insider risk, right? So insider risk management also comes with predefined templates for you to get started very quickly, right? So these are some of the technology building blocks that would provide comprehensive uh, protection of information across your information estate within the organization. Okay, I'll go next. So what are the key limitations or considerations within the current technology? While we have done some implementation of these technologies with the organizations, we have identified that there are some gaps, and there are some I wouldn't call them gaps, but things that you should consider as an organization, the impact of enabling these technologies, right? So for example, the first one is connected apps. What I mean by connected apps is for example, you might have an app called DocuSign, right? Everyone uses DocuSign to sign their documents, right? Maybe PDF documents. Now, DocuSign does not have the native capability of decrypting encrypted documents that were encrypted via sensitivity labels, for example. So you have to make sure that um, any third party applications or applications that you might have built in-house also work seamlessly with your information protection classification, right? So that's one thing to look out for. The second is bulk classification or reclassification. While there are limited options to do that, this is required. For example, when you when you are under a litigation audit or something of that sort, you would require decryption of your non-Microsoft Office files, right? So consider having a service that would provide you with bulk classification or reclassification. While the Microsoft tech stack does provide you with those options, there's something called as a MIP SDK that helps you build that tooling within your organization, but something that you need to be aware of. The third one is records interoperability. There is a limitation whereby default document library level labels, for example, sensitivity labels do not work well with default document library level record labels, right? Where the sensitivity labels never get applied. So there are some interoperability issues. And in some cases, if your retention configuration has been configured um, such that it after every record revision that you create, it will extend the retention. In that case, to reclassify the information, you will have to go through that process, and that results in extending the retention of a document, which might not be an ideal scenario, right? So make sure that this is also covered. You're aware of this particular limitation, and you make some necessary um, arrangements to handle this interoperability issue. Yeah. So next is the hybrid setup. You might have um, organizations might already be working along with Exchange Online. They might be working with Exchange on premises. Organization might also have on premises implementation of SharePoint, right? So if people start uploading, or end users start uploading encrypted documents in these areas, what is the impact, right? How does it work? Does search work on premises? So these are some of the limitations again, and you have to be very careful when organizations have a hybrid setup, because there are some limitations there as well. The next one, and which I think I've encountered this very frequently, is the ask for configuration options to make sure that we only want to start with information classification for our files or documents. We do not want to do it for emails right now. But by default, when you start configuring those labels in the compliance center, you would see that you have no other option but to make sure the labels are always appearing in files as well as for emails, and you cannot segregate them, right? So, however, there are ways by which we have handled such scenarios. We have made sure that there is very minimal impact to Exchange, and if the organization is not ready for Exchange or emails yet, and they only want to start with documents, then that can be handled as well. But that is not an option presented by default to you. You have to make sure you do some changes to the configuration so that this works seamlessly. This is one of the issues that we have encountered while we were doing data discovery. So as I said, by default, Microsoft brings you all the information that's presented in the Content Explorer where your sensitive information lives. There is no way currently to bulk export that particular sensitive information data so that you can look at that information outside of Microsoft 365 and make some choices, right? So that's just something that we have discovered. And enhanced support for user defined permissions. I talked about configuring your labels in such a way that users are able to choose permissions for that documents when they are applying a label. At present, this functionality does not work well with locations like SharePoint, for instance. Um, yeah, so these are some of the limitations or some of the considerations that you have to take with the current technology while you are implementing the Microsoft Information Protection tech stack. With this, I think I'll hand it over to Sanjoyan. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Kunal, for that. That was very, very informative, and you have brought forward your practical experience of handling large customers and implementing solutions, information technology solutions, Microsoft Stack in those. And thanks to Vivek as well. You have been a constant partner and providing help and information which we are incorporating in the product to make the product better for all our customers out there. So hello everyone again, I'm Sanjan Mustafi. I'm a principal product manager and I specialize in information protection within Microsoft SharePoint and OneDrive. You can look me up in LinkedIn. I'm pretty active. Any questions you have regarding security compliance within SharePoint and OneDrive, you can ping me. So Kunal, if you don't mind going back one slide, I'll start from there because there are a few very important pointers that Kunal mentioned, which are the bulk classification and reclassification. I'll start my story from there, that what we are bringing now forward that Kunal mentioned as limitations currently in our product stack. So as you are already aware, when you ask your end users in your enterprise to apply protection, understand your data, etc., it's difficult. It's large organization, a lot of employees. You need to train them to understand the data definition, what are the different classifications, and then apply. They have their day job to do. Okay. Plus, this will be a cognitive overload on them. So what we provide additionally is ability to auto classify items, and Kunal briefly touched on that. For example, machine learning, okay, or pattern matching or exact data match, which you can define what is important to you as an organization, and you can define those in our auto classification logic and then apply them. But there can be cases where you just want to apply and classify labels based on the nature of the engagement or nature of the project. I'll give an example of Microsoft. Let's say, my colleagues in Xbox team is working on a highly confidential prototype pending project. Okay, so every file that gets into that SharePoint site which they created, or the team that they have created, needs to be protected and encrypted to the set of people who are working on that, right? You don't want people to miss out by applying a label manually. And for that, we have got the feature of applying a default label as soon as you upload to a SharePoint site. So it can apply the classification and encryption to all the uploaded Office file types there. Also, we are coming up with additional solutions where you can bulk classify existing files, which is a problem within SharePoint today. We have the MIP SDK and the classic AIP scanner that could have scanned your on-prem content and then apply classification, but there was earlier no capability to scan across millions of files that you have in SharePoint and OneDrive that are sitting there and then classify them. So you can just say, hey, I know this site is an important site and there are, let's say, 5,000 files out there. I just want to classify all of them. Okay, there is no pattern, but I want to classify all the files out there. This tech is coming up, and I'll show a slide, and you can register for our previews that are coming up. But we are addressing the limitations that Kunal pointed out earlier. The second one, which is the third box on top, is record interoperability. Yes, this is a real problem today, because if you have applied records management, which is the retention policy, Microsoft technology, and sensitivity label, what happens is when you apply the sensitivity label, it increases, or resets the clock for your, record retention, okay, which may not be desirable. So we are working very closely and coming up with a new design so that we ensure that the clock doesn't reset. So in progress, stay tuned for more. The box on your left, which says configuration options for files and emails, this is a very critical feedback that we have heard from multiple customers, because many customers are starting their journey in the cloud, and then they're like, hey, I have processes in place to identify files only, and we are yet to come up with processes and steps to identify emails and sensitivity across emails, or vice versa. Currently, our infrastructure do not support that segregation, that you can define policies and label according to files or emails. There is an and condition right there. So we are segregating these, and again, stay tuned to hear more. This is coming very soon, where you will be able to now segregate between files and emails. The other part, which is enhanced support for user-defined function, the last box on your bottom right. This is, in several cases, I'll give an example that your company might be working with an external vendor, for example, for marketing or for anything else. The project starts, you bring in a couple of external users, you only want those set of people who are working in the project to read the data, open the data, etc. And then when the project is over, you want to secure the information, right? This typically is done via user-defined permission, because your admin will not know those thousands and hundreds of projects that are happening within your company, and cannot keep creating labels. That label lifecycle management becomes difficult. This is where user-defined permission is very critical, but the current challenge is when you create the user-defined label documents and upload to SharePoint, you are unable to edit those documents. So your productivity is hit, though your security is very high. So we are now bridging that gap. You will be able to co-author just like an existing document in browser and your Office applications, even if you are applying user-defined permission. Again, the private preview is coming up. Kunal, can we now move to the private preview slide, please? Yeah, so I believe, Vivek, we are going to share this deck to all our attendees, and this will be available for download. So please go through the slide on all the important private preview items that we are coming up with. One very critical item that I would like to highlight, which is the second line item on your right, which is for PDFs. PDF is the largest file format. If I combine Word, Excel, and PowerPoint together, PDF goes beyond that. So, I do not need to emphasize how important PDF files are. There was an existing limitation in SharePoint and OneDrive in terms of interpreting and processing labeled PDF files, and we are completely bridging that gap. Preview coming very, very soon. I have put the preview URL there. So aka.ms/odsp security previews. This preview will open up soon. So I invite everybody to nominate yourself or your companies and customers that you're working with to sign up in this preview and provide feedback. With that, I think we have 8 minutes to go. I'll hand it over to Vivek.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Some really great updates, and I can see that from those updates is really going to unblock a number of customer scenarios. So really excited to sort of continue on this design partnership with you and trial all of these features. And again, as Sanjoy said, please refer to this link and participate in this private preview. It's not just about trialing these features. It is also an excellent opportunity to provide direct feedback to Microsoft through this partnership. So really appreciate it. Thank you. Just a last thing for me. I talked about compliance assessment. It's again something which is offered by Microsoft, not Infotechtion specific, but as a Microsoft partner in this space of information protection and governance. We work with Microsoft to offer these compliance assessments free of cost to participating customers. What that gives you is just very quickly overall a 3-week activity. Helps you to discover your sensitive information. It's a very data-based activity. Allows us to work with you to understand your data, understand your use cases, your maturity goals, and based on that, really develop a whiteboard. It's not very clear to see on the screen, but divided across 4 areas: data protection, legal and regulatory compliance, collaboration, and protection of information and prevention of information loss. So across those 4 areas, we use a piece of technology to sit down with you and whiteboard and have those one-line scenarios to understand where your priorities are, to come up with your, the definition of crown jewels. Based on that, we light up the technical capabilities over that 3-week period, leveraging some of those Microsoft 365 components Kunal mentioned. So really an evidence-based recommendation to align with what you have identified as priorities for you. And through that, you get a recommendation, a report, which leads into a development of a very lightweight, but very relevant and very practical blueprint or a solution design and a business case for you to consider some of the Microsoft capabilities. And as part of that blueprint, you receive recommendations, reasons, a roadmap, as you see a little bit on the screen there. What are the steps? There are a number of technologies which come together to achieve that goal and vision for information protection. What should you do first? What should you do next? What are the prerequisites for you to be successful? And how long is a piece of string? How long before you start realizing your maturity goals, which you have put on that whiteboard? So that's something available. John will talk to you a little bit more about in his closing note. But I would highly recommend that if you haven't started your information protection journey, then this is really an excellent way to start. It's something which is supported and funded by Microsoft. On that note, I'm going to hand it back to John.
Great. Thank you all very much. Terrific content and very, very insightful. And so as you think about next steps, make sure that you take a look at some of these case studies in particular. That'll give you a sense of how this works in real life, which is always much more productive than just theoretically thinking about it. And I guess in that context, I just wanted to maybe ask a quick question of each of you before we go to some final comments. And my question is the same for all of you, which is that we talked about starting the journey, but I guess I'd like to back up a second, and maybe from your experience, what typically galvanizes an organization to start the journey? What's the driver that all of a sudden, because I've been in this space a long time, we've been talking about it a long time, what typically drives action that gets organizations to move forward? And Sanjay, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go Kunal and then Vivek on that question.
Vince, what I am learning in this area, and I've been in this area for now 7 years for SharePoint security and compliance. The fundamental fact is that we request our customers to know their data, to understand the data. Unless there are several pillars which Kunal presented earlier. For example, I want to retain my data. I want to protect my data. I want to see where insider risk is happening. All this is possible when you know where your data is and when you know what that data is, because within the cloud, there can be a mix. So if there is one takeaway I would like every participant from this meeting is either within your company or with the customers that you're working with, please advocate this understanding of data. John.
Kunal, what would be a typical force that galvanizes action in your case?
Well, the key driver that I've seen in my case, right, working with customers, it's just a massive increase in the range of devices, for example, people work with these days, um, on the cloud, on premises, your mobile devices, the bring your own device ability that allows people to work with from anywhere, right? That I think has galvanized this thing for organizations, and they need to take control now, right? And again, if you're talking about a key takeaway for me, even though I work in the tech stack area of things, right? But the key thing that I think people should know about is that change and adoption is a massive important part of this whole journey, right? And it needs to be embedded in this journey right from the beginning and not towards the end. And that's where typically organization make those mistakes, that we will do it towards the end, but I think they need to be a part of the program right from the start. Yeah.
And Vivek, a key takeaway that drives people to action on your side?
Well, I mean, +1 to everything what Kunal and Sanjoyan have said. But unfortunately, still in most of the cases, I see audit findings, penalties are still driving. I hope people on the call are not one of them, and you are thinking proactively about it. But it is one of those things with Microsoft Cloud is happening. Everybody is moving towards Microsoft Cloud. So for me, it's that transition to cloud is what's making organizations think about some of these things where, as I said previously, just firewall protection is not good enough anymore.
So on behalf of Sanjay and Kunal and Vivek, thank you all very much for being with us here today. I think this has been a most productive time. You will get a recording of the presentation, and so please feel free to share it with some of your colleagues and peers. And if you would like to have a conversation about setting up proof of concept or discuss some of the particular issues that you have, we would be happy to have that. I think one last thing on my side in terms of a key takeaway is kind of harkens back to what Vivek started with, which is that the nature of the challenge has changed. And it was in the process of changing before COVID, but the pandemic accelerated all of this to a dramatic degree, where all of a sudden information is being created in every sector, on every device, in every location in an organization. And those areas of protection, security, utilization, governance have now become interconnected issues. And it all begins with protecting the information that you have and knowing where it is and in what form it is. So thank you all very much for your time. We really do appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you on the next webinar.